Hello everyone, my name is Tyler and today we're going to be doing a very special video for this channel. You might know me from the Jams and Tea podcast, a music podcast where we review new releases, classic records and everything in between, also on this channel. But today I'm going to be doing something on my own and a little bit different. I'm going to be breaking down the discography of storied electronic music giants, Autechre. So, who are Autechre? Autechre are Rob Brown and Sean Booth, two UK-based musicians originating from Manchester. Forming in 1987 and initially releasing music under the name Lego Feet, their signing to storied electronic music label Warp and their inclusion of their music on the influential and landmark compilation Artificial Intelligence in 1992 launched one of the most unpredictable, artistically fulfilling, and just generally remarkable discographies in all of electronic music. And they're still going, with hints of one or even two albums being complete and in the hands of Warp as we speak, waiting to be released when the right time comes. It's worth acknowledging, I think, before we launch into this video countdown, that Autechre have released a colossal amount of music that goes far beyond the 13 studio albums that I'll be talking about today. Their numerous EPs and live soundboard recordings are essential pieces of the Autechre story, and to overlook or exclude them when diving into their discography is to do yourself a disservice. Particularly the EPs, I think, which are almost always considerably shorter than the studio records, and particularly in the 90s era, provide a more accessible and high quality gateway into their music. I want to especially shout out the 1995 EP Garbage, which is among their best releases in my opinion, and as well as this year's soundboard release AE Live 2016 to 2018, which features 8 hours of live sets, and in particular the 2018 sets from Melbourne and Dublin, which I think are frankly the most impressive music that the duo have ever recorded. But if you're new to Autechre and interested in finding out what they're all about, the albums will still give you a great sense of their many musical evolutions. And I've tried to structure my reviews in this countdown so that if you haven't heard the record that I'm talking about, you should be able to get a pretty good idea from my description whether or not it'll be something that you're interested in hearing. And I'll highlight along the way which particular albums are good entry points to their sound. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started. From worst to best, these are the studio albums of Autechre. Inca Nebula is a straightforward and unassuming beginning for the Manchester duo, and a capitalization for Warp on the success of the Artificial Intelligence compilation, as well as being a record that was apparently constructed by the label from a generous helping of tracks that Rob and Sean provided. As such, and much like its similarly straightforward follow-up Amber, it lacks the compositional finesse and thrilling subversion of their later material. With its roots firmly in the acid house scene, for example a track like Bike would fit comfortably on Orbital's Green album, Inca Nebula introduces the sparse, heavily atmospheric sound that would come to define the duo's early period, while still being rooted in fairly conventional techno rhythms. The gorgeous, watery pads that surface midway through Bike hint at the more liquid-feeling synth textures of later releases, and the languorous, meditative Eggshell meanders thoughtfully for 9 minutes in a similar mode. The haunting ambience of Wind, which recalls another childhood favourite of mine, Leftfield's Leftism, sounds absolutely gorgeous, but it does outstay its welcome, however, drifting for 11 minutes through the ether. And the tinny tones of Matel seem like a dry run for more fleshed out timbres that can be found all over an album like 1995's Try Repetae. The punchy beats of Bass Cadet and Doctrine are a welcome breakup to all the ambience, though they also feature some of the most dated and dull synth sounds on the whole record. Worse still, there are some tracks here which, in my opinion, fall flat entirely, such as the cheesy, lifeless lounge beat of Low Ride, and the plonky and really grating keyboards of Autechre, as well as the ultimately lifeless plod of Bronchus 2. Thankfully though, the record does end with its strongest track, the superbly expansive 444, which serves nicely as a recapping of the many textures found throughout the record in service of a more captivating, beautiful arrangement. So ultimately, while there are plenty of things to like in Inca Nebula, it does feel like a bit of a failure to fulfill the potential of even the artificial intelligence contributions, and in the context of their 90s run, Inca Nebula is a mere warm-up for what was to come. Jumping ahead 15 years in their career, 2008's Quaristice represents a radical structural shift for the duo, drastically reducing the runtime of their pieces from an average of nearly 9 minutes on the previous album Untilted to 20 mostly 2 to 3 minute pieces here, spread across a similar 70 plus minute runtime. A number of complaints have been lodged about Quaristice over the years, that it feels scattered, that the shortness of the pieces leaves them feeling lacking, and that there's simply no cohesion. But I think that once you adjust to the unusual, in fact drastically different, structural rhythms of Quaristice, the way that it's pieced together actually makes perfect sense. These are heavily edited, almost pop single versions of what would normally be lengthier, more progressive and ever-shifting compositions. This is evidenced by the existence of companion compilation album versions and the multiple Quaristice quad-range EPs, which provide a total of nearly 4 hours of additional material that is exclusively alternate versions, variations, extended mixes, and sometimes remixes of the tracks on the original album. As such, the Quaristice extended universe, if you will, is a treasure trove for Autechre fans, ripe for being turned into playlists, mixes, and for the band's exercises in playing with structure, exercises that they engage in throughout their career, as we'll see, to be thoughtfully turned over to their attentive and idiosyncratic audience. Now, this is a cool concept, and as an Autechre fan, it certainly is fun to play around with all the material, but it does result in work that feels purposefully formless, lacking the compositional tour de force and sweep of their best stuff, and sometimes, if I'm being a bit harsh, feeling like homework. That said, the original Quaristice album is, on its own merits and disregarding all the alternative extras, a decently well-constructed work with a fair share of highlights. Opening ambient piece Altabiz is stunning, one of the most warmly gorgeous things the band had ever composed. The shuffling, buzzing progression of the PLC traverses a number of sonic ideas within a brisk 4 minutes. The rich and gorgeous sounding sim sparkles with vibrant energy initially, before zooming out to a more spacious, deep ambience by its conclusion. A microcosm of the progression of the album as a whole. The bubbling, playful FWZE is beguiling. The shuffling distortion of I.O. thrills with its bizarre time signature. The pinball-evoking bouncy castle is headache-inducing but weirdly funny. And the track Rail notably previews a kind of cavernous, bass-heavy, squelching sonic aesthetic that would become a strong characteristic of their 2010 studio and live material. The homestretch trio of WNSN, Chenk 9, and No 2 is one of their best 3-track sequences. WNSN is initially almost scary in its twisted carnival house horror, but gradually settles into an eerie, affecting groove. Chenk 9 is classic Autechre, a rattling, thrilling piece of shifting dance music. And by contrast, No 2 is almost pure emptiness, like staring into a vast chasm at the edge of the universe with only distant stars to mark your place. a hollow void into which the rest of the album dramatically empties. These are all strong tracks, some of them great, but they are scattered amongst a bunch of comparatively half-baked ideas that only make them seem stronger by comparison, and do not amount to a particularly thrilling finished product in the context of the other records that Quaristice surrounds. For fans, or those wishing to seek out and nail the entire Autechre discography, it is of course well worth checking out, and those with the investment will likely find the experience of dipping between all the different versions fascinating and enlightening, as I have. But casual listeners seeking to prioritise records should steer clear of this one for now. It offers many rich rewards and is no doubt a strong record that would stand out among the careers of other artists, but for Autechre, Quaristice feels like a mere curiosity, with structural ideas that they would explore more fruitfully throughout the 2010s. Of all Autechre records, 1994's Amber, the follow-up to Inca Nebula, is certainly among the most conceptually evocative, if not as immediately stimulating as what was still to come. It evokes the surreal atmosphere of exploring a desert planet in a distant solar system. The swirls of foil approximate the passing of a sandstorm. The strings and eerie vocal loops of Silverside evoke the feeling of being hopelessly lost. The epic clutter of Further is almost nightmarish and subtly evokes a claustrophobic feeling. While highlight tracks Montreal, Slip, and 9 are comparatively uplifting, even playful, the second half of the record does take a darker turn. A standout track is Pizzo, which has this immediately gripping, advancing and receding percussive twang atop a simple but repetitive melodic motif, both of which gradually become swallowed by this incredibly haunting synth, resulting in a feeling of crushing isolation that really stays with you. The most understated track here, Yulquin, is also among the most immediately beautiful. It has this neatly repeating synth line which is incredibly soft, and it has a tactile quality against a bedrock of analog white noise. Some of the most texturally rich and blissful music from the band's entire 90s period. The final 1-2 punch of Nil and Tear Tear are like a harsh wake-up call in comparison, the former track echoing Inca Nebula with a slow but punchy central melody that brushes against icy percussion, and the latter track effectively building its urgency by counterintuitively slowing as it progresses, hinting at the gradual deconstruction that would define their early 2000s work, and a technique that the band would later reuse for the track Ray, one of the standouts on 1998's LP5. That said, while there is plenty to enjoy here, and the record marks a clear advancement from Inca Nebula, it lacks the compositional density and darkness of Repetae, as well as that record's more ambitious and unconventional track structures, which leaves it, in terms of the band's career progression, ultimately feeling more transitional and even a bit formless. Additionally, there are a few moments across the record where the sonic toolkit does sound a bit clunky. The canned strings of Silverside and the lackluster pondering of Glitch in particular stand out as lowlights. As well, at this point in the band's career, it's already noticeable that a lot of their most compelling music, the stuff that's really setting them apart from other artists on Warp, is the stuff on their EPs. Particularly the Anti, Garbage, Anvil Vapor, and Envain EPs, all of which were released between 94 and 97, and all of which contain some of the most remarkable music Rob and Sean have ever produced. In particular, I recommend the Garbage EP, which I think is in the top 5 of all of their releases across all formats, and is the perfect introduction to the duo for those of you that don't quite yet have the appetite for 70-minute records. That said, if you're new to IDM and you are interested in albums, while Amber is not the record I'd recommend to get an idea of who Autechre are, it is probably the most accessible and immediately rewarding album that the band have released. 1995's Try Repetae was the first Autechre record I heard, and I suspect it may have been for many others as well, as it has long been held as the crowning achievement of their early period. A synthesis of the sounds developed on Inca Nebula and Amber, with some of the most sophisticated and dense production that they had yet laid to tape. It was also released in 1995, around the time where IDM was peaking in relevance, yet still slightly before more seminal genre releases were put out by artists such as Aphex Twin, Boards of Canada, Eamon Tobin, and Square Pusher. Alongside the Garbage and Anvil Vapor EPs, it makes a perfect entry point into their work and contains some of their most immediately rewarding compositions to date. Opener Dale has these deep bass rumbles underlying a simple, repetitive melody corrupted by disorienting, swirling percussion. Album's standout Clipper is a slow-moving giant with a coy melody at its center, approaching and receding from view atop these propulsive rhythms. The record's twin centerpieces are the lengthy epics Rotar and Stud. Rotar, to me, has one of the most iconic openings of any Autechre track, a soft but bouncy rhythm that always gets stuck in my head, and rhythms that remain constant, shifting very subtly throughout as haunting tones wash over it. It's one of the most hypnotic tracks from this era of the duo. Meanwhile, Stud is even longer and more minimal, held together with some of the most unsettling sounds on any Autechre track. This one is a little over long, arguably, but it hardly matters because this is the point at which the record turns into a more propulsive direction with a trio of shorter 4 to 5 minute tracks that are easily among the most accessible on the album. Yuto has these acid house melodies with fuzzed out, compressed bass tones and a skittering beat. C/Pack is a gorgeous extension of the melodic timbres of Amber. And if it weren't for its disorienting rhythms, Gnit would fit right at home on one of Aphex Twin's ambient albums. I'm particularly fond of the penultimate piece here, Overand, a gentle ambient track very much in the same vein as Amber's Yulquin, but even more pointedly pretty. To me, it simulates the feeling of total clarity, when something you've been mulling over for days falls perfectly into place. It's one of my favourite pieces to read and write and think and fall asleep to, and an absolute masterclass in musical minimalism. The record ends with the similarly contemplative but more unkempt, twisted throbbing of Aries Dio, which meanders in place atop these gentle washes of white noise, the slow sound of a record receding from view and evading grasp, practically begging to be replayed from the beginning so you can try again and again to unlock its secrets. Overall, Try Repetae is a brilliant summation and development of the early period of Autechre, and it deserves all the respect it gets, even if it feels to me like a mere footnote in terms of what was to come directly next from the duo. Jumping ahead again in the Autechre discography, this time 15 years to 2010's Oversteps, which is a unique record in the Autechre catalogue, particularly at this juncture of their career, as it has a primarily ambient focus, with even the more percussive tracks having a relatively muted, gentle feel. It also has a more melodic focus than pretty much all of their material from the last 10 years, and even a lot of their 2000s stuff, where melody is always present, but often in a fashion where it is either subverted or buried. Here, most prominently in the brusque electro-baroque melodrama of Known One, the melody is both tangible and surprisingly consistent across the track, even as these sheets of fluid noise squeal atop it. Opening track RS lays out the ambient focus, with these slow washes of cavernous sound that gradually ease into the track like a tide coming in, before giving way to the comparatively punchy, scratching melodies of Islanders. Oversteps is such an unassuming, at times even welcoming record, that all the same seems hesitant to remain approachable, almost receding from view as soon as moments of clarity are achieved. This strange presentation meant that for me, approaching their records in chronological order, Oversteps seemed more like a sidestep, a weird kind of diversion or experiment that never quite panned out into something that felt holistically complete. At least, that's how I felt initially. Over time, particularly recently, the record has really grown on me, and I've come to appreciate the way that it gently lays the groundwork for the towering opus that would be 2013's Exai, while still carving out its own subtle identity. It is in many ways a perfect record for beginners to Autechre who are interested in their later period but intimidated by the length or density of some of those other albums. For hardcore fans who seek a more assertively stimulating experience, it might understandably fall short, but I think that once you embrace Oversteps on its own terms, it opens up to you in a really nice way and reveals itself to be the duo's most outwardly pretty, conventionally beautiful work. The sonic landscapes of Autechre are like those of an ice planet, and there are a number of tracks that for me conjure imagery of sticking your head beneath the cracked surface of a frozen lake, only instead of water you see a night sky full of twinkling stars and galactic clouds. It's dreamlike, incredibly evocative, and as I've probably conveyed, just jaw-droppingly gorgeous at points. The incredibly tactile, sparkling melody of Sea on Sea is just phenomenal, and the ambience beneath it has a terrific sense of real depth, like peering into a canyon. The gentle warbles of PT2, PH8 make for perfect mood music, and with a good pair of headphones, the different sounds circle around you, approaching and receding from different angles, almost a virtual reality experience. Some of the tracks have more aggressive beats too, such as the shuffling cue play, the fuzzy bounce of trill, and the washes of distortion that lay atop the ascending melody of D-Show Cub. These are interspersed with further moments of stark clarity, such as the synthetic bell tones of O equals 0, the gentle thrum of Oz VX3, which sounds like an idling space station, and the luminescent glow of Krylon, making for a well-rounded experience that flows effortlessly. The record concludes with the brilliant progressive stomp of the spacious but hard-hitting UOP, with a simple but repetitive melody that blares across the mix in these bassy punches of buzzing electronic noise, harsh but never evading grasp, demanding and playful in equal measure. It all adds up to a thrilling finale to one of their most underrated albums that might not hit with the same punch as their best records, but I think deserves a fair shake all the same. 1998's LP5 represents an impressive step forward from the band from their early material, synthesizing the ambient richness of Repetae with the crunching percussion of Chiastic Slide, but overall upping the ante in terms of intensity. This is by far the band's most propulsive, demanding record up to this point in their career, and effectively self-titling it demonstrates that the band basically intended to represent everything their 90s period had built towards, before they flipped the script entirely with their early 2000s material. Though at times it must be said LP5 does feel a bit transitional, and occasionally even a little dated. The melodic plinking of Melv, which sounds like a grand piano-sized xylophone ditty, and the somewhat underwhelming Vos-in stand out as particular weak points on the record that halt the flow in a regrettable way. That said, there are still plenty of incredible highlights here that stand as some of their most thrilling and accomplished compositions. Acro Year 2 opens the record strongly with twinkling, buzzing melodies atop frenetic percussion and anchored by gorgeously ghostly synth tones. The disgusting, bass-heavy violence of 777 juxtaposes these frenetic tonal bleeps with these more haunting, graceful, almost whale song-like tones that gently reverberate at the bottom of the mix. Ray is one of the more overtly emotional tracks from Autechre's early period, with an aggressive, shuffling beat that gradually slows in sympathy with these longing, almost heartbreaking ambient tones. The way the actual melodic core of the track skitters around and arpeggiates toward the conclusion is such a gorgeous detail in and of itself that it's practically overwhelming from an emotional standpoint. Album's standout under Boak is a return to the irreverent playfulness of the first two songs, particularly 777, though there is more space here, and the way that Rob and Sean manipulate and toy with the mixing and sequencing is easier to observe and pulls you along in a more immediate way. The mid-track breakdown creates a new, more melodic percussive progression, leaving the synth pads aside and establishing the beats themselves as the new melodic core. As the tempo speeds up, Rob and Sean shove more beats in there to extend the melody and riff on it in different creative ways, in an almost jazz-like fashion, as ghostly pads wheeze subtly behind them, almost like an after-image of the percussion itself, which then becomes a new counter-melody, playing off the ever-shifting percussive melody, as these two melodies rise together at an overwhelming, ecstatic climax. The deceptively simple arch carrier features swelling strings that surround a clanking metallic beat that almost sounds like robotic bird chirps. It's fairly straightforward in the first half, but eventually the rhythms shift endlessly in pure Autechre fashion, never content to stay in one place, always poking at the different possible permutations of a musical idea, breathlessly dragging the listener along. The record concludes with Drain 2, which is one of the most awe-inspiring closers on any Autechre album, featuring these blaring synthetic horn tones that roar skyward as Rob and Sean continually manipulate the percussion, a textural exercise in how sounds feel. It caps off one of the most influential and important records of the 90s IDM scene. And while structurally LP5 lacks the tightness and sweep of their greatest records, it is undeniably a thrilling experience. Many an Autechre fan will tell you that 2003's Draft 7.30 is the most underappreciated album of their 2000s period. And honestly, they'd be right to. Though upon initial listens it seems little more than a slightly more straightforward continuation of the sonic ideas begun with 2001's Confield, deeper listening reveals it to be a standalone beast of its own nature, specialising much like Confield's lentic catachresis in taking the initial elements of songs and breaking them down in front of us, pulling at them from all sides, reshaping them, deconstructing them completely until they are either an array of formless sounds or something new entirely. Once the record is understood in this way, it becomes fascinating, both a thought exercise in what makes music music, and also a dizzying demonstration of the infinite possibilities of tracks in terms of how Rob and Sean construct them, which I think is referenced with the title of the record. Additionally, while previous album Confield proved an exercise in experimenting more heavily with generative software to create music, here the construction is more deliberate and easier to grasp, with tracks often reducing the intensity as they progress rather than increasing it as they often did on Confield. This results in a record that in many ways can be more difficult to wrap your head around upon initial listens, as the structural fuckery wrong foots you, and as soon as you have a track within your grasp, it collapses into a disorienting mutation of itself. The superb opener, Xylem Room, is a perfect showcase of the record's remarkably dense approach. The track morphs gradually from something rigid and angular to a plodding array of flattened electronic grasshopper crickets and thuds. Second track and pre-release single 4554558 does something similar, but with fewer snatches of melody to grab onto, and an ultimately more violent if rhythmic conclusion. 6IE.CR has one of the more accessible beats on the record, shifting from initially harsh but danceable groove to something more measured and pretty, until eventually only ambient tones remain. Visible across all these tracks is the duo's continuing fascination with beats and percussion as the driving force of their music, with their rhythmic focus overtaking and sometimes even disregarding melody entirely. The record's centerpiece and biggest highlight is the 11-minute Saoirse, which represents the most demonstrative and straightforward example of the LP's deconstructive style. A YouTube commenter memorably described it as the sound of robots performing surgery when something goes horribly wrong, and that image has always stuck with me, as the track's initial minutes do have a focused, procedural feel, before 4 minutes in the collapse begins, with violent stabs of percussion asserting themselves stubbornly until gradually the minimal melody itself falls apart into ebbing tones in a void of thrashing, kicking metal. The squelching noise of Theme of Sudden Roundabout is downright unpleasant, but juxtaposes an ethereal melody in a way that feels more haunting than irritating, even if the track is overall one of the record's less successful exercises. Late album pieces such as P.:Intil and V-Proc experiment with beats clearly influenced by hip-hop, and listening to Rob and Sean delightfully probe at the possibilities of their deconstruction is dizzying, particularly in the case of V-Proc, which has one of the straight-up hardest beats on the whole album. The record concludes with a minimal but impressive reniform pulse, which has the feeling of a slow death, full of subdued, haunting tones that clash like frantic neurons firing. Everything very subtly builds until the final 2 minutes, where it all drops away into near silence, a muffled rhythm persisting, like the track's own afterimage, before itself falling away into darkness. 2013's Exai marked a considerable leap forward from the more languorous ambient textures of Oversteps. Both in terms of sonic development, this is a much harder hitting record, and in terms of length, at 2 hours of material split across a double disc format. On Exai, Rob and Sean construct these thick and layered walls of constantly shifting sound, backed by these insistent driving but heavily textural grooves and evasive melodies. In its length, it sees the boys begin to continue the structural experimentation of Quaristice, but instead of creating multiple projects across various formats, they smartly unify the extended sonic universe here into a sprawling, dense, single canvas that pulls you in from the disarming, skittish beat and blown-out grooves of opener Fleur. The extended 10-minute soundscape of Erlight and Get Zero is a particularly remarkable piece, moderate in tempo but consistently moving forward, dancing around various rhythmic ideas and these staticky bursts of noise, before falling away into near silence halfway through and reforming itself into something new and larger, a thrilling non-linear development. The shimmering ambient wall that serves as a backdrop to these insistent percussive slaps makes Repetae C another first disc highlight, and the squelchy textures of NTS Exai recall Oversteps in feel, though the track develops into this more morose second half that gives it a more progressive feel than anything on that record. The aggressive beat and dark soundplay of Vico S is more intense than almost anything Autechre had done for years before it, and in retrospect it seems like a precursor for a piece like Elseq's Feed One, and the general trend of Rob and Sean's subsequent releases to explore noisier, more claustrophobic mixes, as we'll discuss. Disc 2's No Dish utilizes these gorgeous, pillowy synths and complicates them with this violent, stumbling beat and electronic squelches. The nightmarish Run Repic has this sprinting beat and unnerving melodic synths that evoke the feeling of running from some horrific unseen enemy. The aggressive SPL9 is probably the record's noisiest track, absolutely battering the listener with this cavalcade of crackling, electrical violence, like watching a bonfire of static devour everything around you for miles, until the track eventually consumes itself. The mysterious Cloudline is among the more beautiful tracks here, with this steady, throbbing beat that pushes against these ghostly, whining tones that fluctuate across the mix, approaching and receding like a nervous phantom. As this 10-minute track develops, various melodic counterpoints dance in and out of view, pushing the piece gently forward as you become lost in the swirl of parts. This is a track that's actually kind of intimidated me the first time I heard it, but it's steadily grown on me, to the point that I now think it's one of the record's most impressive achievements. Penultimate track Rex On proves that after over an hour and a half the record is still full of surprises, as Rob and Sean introduce an organic breakbeat sample and proceed to tease and eventually dismantle it, before the piece itself evolves into a kind of eerie, buzzing melodrama. There are some diversions across the album that I do find a little less immediately interesting, such as the thrumming buzz of Prac F, the playful clatter of Tuanorizon, and the bassy rattle of Decolock, but these serve the record well as transitory pieces between larger or more immediate excursions. Notably though, fans of Exai will note that I have so far neglected to talk about the twin monoliths at the centre of the record. The 12-minute Blade Laws is the longest individual piece on Exai, and probably the single best track that you could play to someone to get them interested in Autechre's 2010s era. It has a simple but foot-tapping beat that pushes the song forward, and this really engrossing, just colossal atmosphere that builds and builds as the song's melodic repetition intensifies, until eventually the beat is left behind entirely and you're swirling in this all-encompassing maelstrom of beautiful ambient noise. Disc 2 opener 1-1 runs a comparatively brisk 7 minutes, but packs an incredible punch with this clanging beat that cheekily moves around the audio channels, creating a disorienting feel until it is eventually swallowed by this pristine, shining tone that compresses and crushes the beat violently until it folds into itself. The album closes out brilliantly with the twinkling bass-heavy tones of YJYUX, which sparkles like constellations flooding your eyeline, and sends the record off searching into the darkness, gone too soon, with the listener having no choice but to dive back into the strange and eclectic world to pass its depths again and again. The first time you hear Exai, it might completely throw you for a loop, but it stands as a shining example of the sheer power of Rob and Sean's compositional skill, a stimulating sensory feast that is full of surprises. 2005's Untilted has been one of the most rewarding Autechre records for me personally, as it has an immediacy that I instantly connected with, but I still found myself discovering new things to love in it after dozens of listens. With a daunting 70-minute runtime spread across only 8 tracks, it may seem less inviting than some of their more popular records, but I actually find it to be more welcoming than the two that precede it, and more enjoyable on a purely surface level without necessarily delving into the intricacies that lie beneath. It is also worth noting that Untilted is perhaps their danciest and most deliriously entertaining record to date. Opener LCC has this fucking hard beat that slaps. Like literally, it is driven by a metallic slapping sound, and it delightfully evolves from that hard-hitting opening to an ethereal second half that pairs it with some playful and pretty synth tones. Following this opening is a trio of 9-minute epics that make for one of the most absorbing and accomplished sequences of music on any Autechre album. Apacial section begins violently, but breaks down into an amusing back and forth between the central beats and a playful melodic progression, before deconstructing further into something more minimal and contemplative. The second half of this track in particular is one of my favourite sections of any piece that they've ever done. The brilliant pro radii, by comparison, is more immediate and propulsive, employing some wonderfully deep tones that sound like the distant bouncing of balls in a basketball court. Indeed, the track also utilises creative vocal samples from, of all things, a tennis match. In the back half, the track settles into this irresistible melodic groove, with these pulsing ambient pads elongating the beats and providing a surface on which we can observe Rob and Sean cheekily pulling at the edges of their creation. The bustling mayhem of the playful augmatic disport has the same dance beat core as opener LCC, but upon the integration of a fuzzy synth beneath the chaos, the track gradually opens up and ends in an amusing twist with a very simple and unadorned beat constructed with these warm bass tones. The second half of the record is less immediately thrilling and is where much of the discoveries of repeated listens will reveal themselves. The record's only weak point is its shortest track, Aira, which has an interesting progression but feels a little bit like a retreat of the last few tracks, and could have benefited from a little more expansion. That said, the deceptively simple melodies of Fermium clatter with a driving intensity, and devolve brilliantly into an absolute racket of ringing tones that are ultimately flattened into a homogeneous drone. The squelching, bouncy tones of the trees reveal hidden depths as a constantly evolving but more subtle piece of percussion fuckery that bears more than a passing resemblance to similar exercises on Draft 7.30. The record ends with the cavernous passages of 16-minute epic Sublimate, which begins as a propulsive percussive exercise, before gradually transforming into a captivating landscape of sparse, heavily atmospheric squelches, constantly in motion and searching, exploring and pushing at the limits of the sound, and with repetitive motifs that keep the listener grounded and captivated throughout. Overall, Untilted is an undeniably fantastic achievement for the duo, the climactic work of an era where the pieces had gradually become more and more complex and deconstructive in nature, but consistently belie a tremendous affection for and even obsession with the untapped possibilities of hip-hop and dance music. The colossal NTS Sessions project, released across 4 weeks in April 2018, is the most sprawling, dense, and difficult work of Rob and Sean's entire career. Across 8 hours and 4 separate installments, the sessions gradually progress from sinister, plodding minimalism to fully fledged apocalyptic dance music, to monstrous, sludgy violence, to pristine ambient soundscapes, with plenty of strange detours along the way, and most crucially, a strongly structured progression that provides plenty of reprieves between its most demanding sections. It can be viewed and evaluated as one cohesive 8-hour project, as I'm doing here, or you can view it as 4 discrete albums in their own right, each with a musical narrative and its own distinct stages and ideas. I think that if it has one weakness to evaluating it as a single 8-hour project, it is that experiencing it as such is a truly wearying, physically and mentally draining experience, and not something I would recommend lightly. It is also, I think, an exaggeration to call it 8 hours of the best music Autechre have ever made, though I would say that easily more than half of it, maybe even 3/4 of it, does fit that descriptor. That said, it is important to appreciate the attack and withdrawal structure here that highlights the strongest pieces, while still providing an experience within and across each session that feels cohesive and more or less consistently engaging. Much of the most abrasive and volatile material can be found in Session 1, which begins in unassuming fashion with the slow, plodding birth of T1A1 and BQ, which make for half an hour of material and are probably among the weakest individual pieces across all 4 sessions, which does open NTS on a somewhat off-putting note, though tonally and texturally they do serve a purpose, as tracks which gradually ease you into this new world. NTS then roars to life with the harsh metallic clashes of debris funk and the brilliant celestial exploration of the radiant L3 control. Following the interstitial breather of the bright and stuttering carefree counter-dronal, the second half of Session 1 provides some of the most propulsive, vibrantly entertaining material across all 8 hours, with the buzzing, pumping beat of North Spiral, the thumping clatter of the heavily danceable Gonk Steady 1, and the almost conventionally melodic but slow-paced dance floor grind of 4 of 7, all exploring new shades of Rob and Sean's aesthetic palette. Session 1 ends with the dreamy shimmer of 32A_reflected, which is actually the same 7-minute piece played twice simultaneously, with one played frontwards and the other played backwards, so that the two meet in the middle and create this ethereal, palindromic ambient mood piece. Session 2 opens with the fast-paced LEC 97H-Res, a speedier sister piece to Elseq's LEC 6 Zero Inset, which we'll talk about soon. And this track gives way to the spacious thrum of 6 of 8, itself a sister piece to Session 1's 4 of 7. We are then thrown into the swirling nightmare scene of X-Flood, one of 3 major session-wide highlights that can be found on 2. The second highlight is the thick, purring tar pool of Vile Voic, a monolithic, ugly, unrelenting noise exercise that gradually progresses from one pulsing beat to another, before ultimately settling on this grinding liquid rumble that absolutely fucking grooves as hard as Rob and Sean ever have. In fact, the way this track breaks down to almost nothing 5 minutes in, and then slowly ekes up the tension as a new percussive thrum is added and gradually the tempo is increased, is one of the most thrilling sections across all 4 sessions. The third major highlight of Session 2 is the spacious E0, which meanders through deep space in tranquil isolation like an Earth satellite approaching a distant solar system. It is among the most beautiful pieces of music that Rob and Sean have ever composed. Following the ghostly white noise jam of turbile epic casual stipple idle, we get Session 3's simmering clustro casual, the danceable plonk of Splash, and the monolithic 22-minute dance odyssey that is TT1PD. Alongside Blade Laws from Exai and Latent Call from Elseq, TT1PD is one of the most accessible and immediately thrilling tracks of Autechre's late period, a perfect choice to play someone intrigued by this era of their sound. It has these fucking gigantic, pillowy synths that stretch and bleed atop this persistent, clanking wooden beat. And in the second half, the tempo slows down thrillingly to this dirgy, heavy, brilliant breakdown. Just amazing stuff. The similarly intense and building gloss ceramic pushes their sound to thrilling further levels, and the shimmering, nightmare-inducing disorientation of Ninefly sounds like being trapped inside a rotating washing machine of shining mirrored surfaces. Following so much boundary-pushing textural density, Session 3 concludes with the more withdrawn but hypnotic I Carry, which serves as a preview of Session 4's surprising beatlessness. That's right, the 8-hour NTS concludes with 2 hours of pure, dark ambient. Nary a percussive hit in sight, simply waves of cascading synths. There's a surprising amount of negative space in tracks like Shim Ripple Casual, and more deep space evoking in the limitless expansion of the brilliant column 13. Most impressively, the hour-long drone closer All End is simply the most massive individual studio album piece that Rob and Sean have composed to date. Not just in length, but in the actual physical size of the blissful elephantine drone here, which constantly, slowly shifts with these gentle, subtle tones, providing an ultra-slowed melody. And even a section roughly half an hour in where the enormous drone recedes a little to allow those lower, bassier melodic tones to wander around the soundscape more presently. It is difficult, if not impossible, for me to overstate the sheer majesty of this ending. In terms of the imagery and feeling that it evokes, it makes you feel like you're being carried into the afterlife, in a shining, infinitely expanding stargate. In terms of the raw experiential quality of it, it is completely unlike anything else in their entire history, and maybe the most significant single piece of music that Rob and Sean have recorded to date. Yikes. So overall, while NTS doesn't always hit the mark 100% of the time across its 8 languorous hours, there is a clear purpose and traceable narrative arc to the way that everything unfolds, and the cumulative achievement is immensely emotional, particularly with the context of everything that has come before leading up to it. That it isn't, in my eyes, their greatest or even second greatest work is not a slight to it in any respect, but simply a reflection of a quality ceiling that is higher than Everest. "1997's Chiastic Slide will always be a monumentally important record for me, not just in the Autechre discography, but in the wider genres and subgenres of electronic music. It is one of Autechre's most fascinating, engaging, rewarding records that is both vividly transporting in the vast, melodic soundscapes it presents, and strongly affecting in the gentle grace and almost hypnotic progressions of its melodic motifs. Here is a record that represents a vital step forward from 1995's Try Repetae into denser, more brooding soundscapes that sparkle with strange, unconventional textures that instantly stand the record out from others of its time. Consider the splintering wood crunch of all-timer opening track Repetae, that gradually shifts and reforms itself thrillingly across its 9-minute runtime, playfully contrasting with the bubbling and fizzling melodies that surround it. The disorienting Repetae AC appears to sample the sound of footsteps in snow and amplifies and compresses it to a disorienting degree, lending it an uncomfortable, tactile feel. The gorgeously soft Tew is one of their most serene pieces, as the skittering percussion barely skirts the surface of an isolating melody. Rounding out one of the most stunning sequences on any Autechre record is the remarkable Sickly, one of the best songs to play to someone who is new to the group, and one of the strongest melodies that they have ever composed. The ambience that has been a staple of all of their music thus far has never sounded as haunting as it does here, evoking machinery in a desert landscape and standing, in my opinion, as one of the absolute peaks of the IDM genre in the 90s. Tracks like Hub and Recurie evoke the sound of deserted factories, their machinery relentlessly clanking and pressing away. The latter track in particular has one of the most propulsive, addictive beats of the record, which brushes in disorienting fashion against this gradually rising wave of what sounds like ghostly whispers and moans. It is utterly strange and disconcerting and totally unlike anything else anyone was doing in the IDM scene at the time. The playful clanking of Pule relentlessly pushes the record forward in a wave of ambience, like a darker and more unsettling version of Try Repetae's Over and by extension Amber's Yulquin. The record comes full circle with dizzying closer Nuane, echoing the percussive intensity of Repetae but in a more fixed, hypnotic way, constructing and then disassembling a fairly straightforward melody, pushing and pulling at it in a way which looks forward to the more aggressive melodic fuckery of LP5, Confield, and Draft 7.30, slowly unfolding into a pool of its own constituent parts as a metallic rain of static blips saturates the mix in its second half before taking over the track entirely, as though the grand, abandoned factories that many of the tracks had evoked had simply collapsed under the weight of the elements. Chiastic Slide is a high masterpiece, the first of many, and bizarrely a record that seems to get comparatively less attention and love from wider electronic music audiences compared to the records that precede and follow it. That's a real shame, because beneath what might initially appear to be a cold and static exterior is a warm, beating heart, and a thrilling sonic journey that feels totally unique in the band's catalogue. Across over 4 hours of material, 2016's Elseq 1-5 takes the aesthetic established on Oversteps and Exai to unprecedented new heights of exploration. Though it may seem quaint now in comparison to NTS's expansive 8 hours, the focused, vibrant odyssey of Elseq is an absolutely gargantuan trip unlike any other in the band's catalogue for its sheer, unrelenting intensity. Whereas you can break NTS into 4 distinct 2-hour movements, here the 5 EP structure of Elseq is more a set of groupings for the sake of organisation than for the sake of creating separate statements. While you can consume the 5 sections of Elseq separately, their true power is revealed as a unified whole, and their cumulative effect is robbed when they are considered in isolation. While NTS is similarly notable for the grand, wider sweep its material has when viewed holistically, Elseq manages to have a similar breathtaking progression while being more efficient and more essential from moment to moment throughout the journey. The record opens with Feed 1, which is this confronting swirl of violent noise that pulses like the internal organs of an Earth-sized monster for 11 minutes. It creates the sensation of thrashing to stay above the surface of a pool of thick black liquid while unseen creatures try to pull you below. It is one of the most unrelenting pieces the duo have ever released and one of the absolute peaks of their colossal dynamic sound design. It simply has to be heard to be believed. Much of the rest of Elseq's first movement is comparatively easygoing, though still full of surprises. The droning siren atop the bubbling sonic frenzy of C16 Deep Tread is like an air raid blasting in a nuclear wasteland. The melodic bliss of Pendulu HV Moda vibrates and pulses, and the eerie white noise of Curve Caton is an ominous discursion into paranoia. Following that, we get the record's longest and most difficult piece, the kaleidoscopic noise of 27-minute jam LEC6 in set. To date, one of the most assaultive but rewarding pieces in Rob and Sean's entire catalogue. It progresses slowly, sizzling and moaning as it heaves like the breathing of some ancient creature, even as the sounds themselves instill the feeling of being slowly digested and melting from the inside out. What is difficult about LEC6 in set is not just its length, but the blistering textures themselves, which crackle and bleep and simmer with a deliberate pace. The track does shift, but it does so slowly, and through these extended sections of shifting erratic tones that assault with their lack of repetition and screeching timbre, until eventually by the track's conclusion you are left swimming in a verbiage of crackling electrical dissonance. If you survive this far, you are then dropped into the sprawling emptiness of the 22-minute drone piece, Easter, the most meditative track on the record, with these uneasy, nightmarish, droning chords that repeat endlessly and evoke the feeling of being lost in a vast desert that stretches to infinity in every direction. Mid-album highlight Mesh Scenario is a 25-minute hellscape of battering percussion and brightly buzzing tones. It's incredibly impressionistic and frequently breathtaking in its brutality, shifting through a number of different melodic sections, including a fake-out jump scare that still catches me off guard every time. The fourth movement of Elseq features some of the most accessible music of the release, and also some of the most gorgeous and impressive tracks that Rob and Sean have ever released. The heaving start-stop melody of ACDWN2 devolves into a drony breakdown and a progression not dissimilar to some of the tracks on Draft 7.30, and then you get the album's standout, and maybe the most purely beautiful thing that Autechre have ever released, Fold Free Casual. A yearning and spacious progression of pillowy synths that are eventually brutalized by these collapsing, thumping percussive pulses. It evokes imagery of planets in motion colliding into each other, stars being born and collapsing into supernova simultaneously. The beginning and end of the universe. Equally good is the breathtaking latent call, which has an intense, noisy but bouncing beat that eventually slowly disintegrates into haunting ambience before beautifully reconstructing itself in a thrilling twist. It's like Basinski's disintegration loops but with a happy ending. The utterly unique disorientation of Seventh Slip, it gives way to the album's more ambient, reflective final sequence, which moves more slowly, sometimes to a fault. Among the highlights, though, are the overwhelming beauty of the meditative Spaces How V, and a personal favourite of mine, the stunning, forlorn, nocturnal emotion of Frulau, my single most played Autechre track, and one which has never lost its power to transport me to a rainy cityscape in some unknowable future beyond my lifetime. Overall, the way Elseq progresses from the noisy intensity of its first two movements to the ephemeral bliss of its ending mirrors the kind of slow musical deconstruction that we've observed across a lot of the records that we have discussed. Additionally, the genius of this construction, which itself is complicated by this tense push and pull between progression and stasis within individual movements, is something which only gradually reveals itself to you, like an unfurling flower the longer that you spend with it. It is a demanding experience, but all shades of Autechre are revealed here, and it stands as their finest achievement of the 2010s to me. And so, finally, we come to the end. The greatest album that Autechre have released, in my opinion. If you've been following Rob and Sean's records chronologically, even understanding them inside out could not fully prepare you for 2001's Confield. It is a monolithic achievement in electronic music, a garden of complex, thrilling, and violent sound play. It represents the absolute zenith of their technical skill up to this point, and even if they don't view it terribly fondly themselves, its significance in the world of electronic music, as well as its sheer compositional scope and sweep, are undeniable. I often like to think of it as IDM's Kid A moment, where the sonic toolkit of a band that had been consistently pushing themselves to more progressive, ambitious arrangements was almost entirely upended for something altogether more unfriendly, almost volatile, but breathtaking in its beauty, and somehow also feeling retrospectively like the most logical next step and the best possible one. opener, Viscous Poise, highlights this radical shift, a dreamlike textural pool of tense sound play that marries these incredibly tactile metallic raindrop sounds quickened to a dizzying speed with pretty synth tones that meander across one of the band's most serene melodies. The resulting tension of this arrangement leads to a feeling of controlled chaos that the record continues to explore across its 9 tracks. The tactility of the percussion on a track like Sea Fern ensures that every beat feels violent, and the shifting progressions of the rhythms add unpredictability that makes for a near-terrifying sonic experience. Pen Expers attacks you from all sides as a whooshing, climbing melody inches constantly upward, fighting to break through the violent noise that surrounds it. Though the next few tracks are less overtly violent in comparison, they introduce new sonic timbres that are at times uncomfortable, almost sickening. The crackling percussion on the underrated Sim Gishel initially provides a welcome reprieve from Pen Exper's physicality, but close listening reveals a more subtle, unsettling form of violence as the track scrapes at your eardrums with these crackling grooves that fend off a wall of decomposing electronic debris. The discombobulating geometry of parhelic triangle, which reaches into your brain and squeezes it like putty, brushes against these nightmarish ambient tones, making for one of the most unsettling tracks the duo have ever recorded. This feeling of unsettlingness is compounded by the sheer noise assault of Bine, the single most terrifying piece of music that Rob and Sean have ever recorded. It stares into you with vacant eyes and violently shapeshifts, almost anti-musically, but in terms of sheer visceral experience, I consider it one of the most singular, valuable pieces in the Autechre catalogue. The freaky eidetic caisson has carnival-esque vibes that make it feel right out of a horror film, creating this sense of encroaching, upsetting claustrophobia. The textures here fizzle and squelch, menacingly looming out of the relentlessly chugging beat, resulting in a feeling of simultaneous tension and constant progression. The piece is never boring or static. The minimal but equally unnerving uviol continues this tension through a comparatively placid arrangement that slowly and subtly decays in a manner that presages Draft 7.30's Saoirse, an icy landscape that evokes the feeling of being stalked by an unseen figure. It's just the calm before the storm, however, as sickening closer lentic catachresis floods the mix with violent stabs and glitches, an exercise in surreal terror like an AI having a brain aneurysm, or like drowning in a pool of your own memories, dozens of connected but together dissonant fragments piling on top of each other in an agony of pressing static. Confield is Autechre's greatest achievement because every single piece and detail of the puzzle feels utterly integral to its overall effect, either filling out the sonic palette in new and disorienting ways or complementing previous elements of the record in a way that forms a kind of internal sonic evolution. Where their previous albums evolved from each other, this is a record that continually shapes and reshapes itself in front of you, an endlessly mutating digital soup that nevertheless has a clear, cohesive structure and a compositional sweep that breathlessly pulls you along at every turn. Confield is a monolithic achievement for Rob and Sean, and one of the most significant records in the modern history of electronic music. And that wraps up the discography breakdown from worst to best of the 13 studio albums of Autechre to date as of August 2020. Hoping that the apparently already recorded and ready next album releases from Autechre come soon, and if they do, depending on the length, size, scope and scale and sonic content, we may or may not review it on the main Jams and Tea podcast, but even if we don't, I will be sure to create an individual video for it, because it will no doubt be incredibly fascinating to pick apart and spend time with, as all of their records are. So I hope that if you're new to Autechre, you took away from this video what their kind of sound is about at all these various stages of their career, what sounds most interesting to you, and if you haven't heard any of their records, I hope that you are encouraged to check them out and dive into them, because for me, I consider their discography one of the most rewarding and mind-expanding discographies in all of music. Like, you just hear stuff in what Autechre does that you cannot get elsewhere, and that is basically the highest compliment that you can pay an artist, I think. But yeah, if you are familiar with Autechre, what is your favourite Autechre album? What are your favourite Autechre tracks? And what do you think of my reviews? What do you think of my ranking? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Did I do your favourite album dirty? Did I not put your favourite record high enough? Or did I put a record you don't particularly care for too high? Please let me know in the comments section below, and follow me on Twitter. My handle is in the description box for this video, and feel free to interact with me about Autechre, or I love to hear other people's perspectives on the music, because it is so like each person's experience of an Autechre record is so individualized. Like, no one has the same response, which is what makes it so interesting to talk about them. So I'd love to hear from you about what you think, and yeah, thank you for sticking with me for this gargantuan and dense video, basically the length of an Autechre album, and I hope you got something useful out of it. And please stick around for further episodes of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we review new releases and classic records, as well as further videos on this channel that will be breaking down from worst to best the discographies of other seminal artists. So make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss out on that content, and let us know what you would like to see. Thanks again for sticking around. My name is Tyler, and this has been Autechre, worst to best.